It's so great to see such a fantastic turnout, especially for the inaugural event. So big props to everybody, Americares, too, for pulling this together. And again, it's great to see so many people interested in here. As you noticed, and I'm sure even just in reading headlines, it's obvious that the number of natural disasters is increasing, but we also have the numbers to back it up. Just since 1970, the number of weather-related disasters has actually almost quadrupled. We're talking about 400 or so a year annually. And when you think about the impact on people, that number is nearly 200 million people around the world. And more often than not, we are talking about low-income, underserved communities. These are people who may already be teetering on the brink. There's no wiggle room. There is no plan if some disaster comes in and wipes everything out. And it happens because these disasters every year are putting 26 million people into poverty. They were already in a rough spot. So the important part about preparing communities is that that in turn gives both the communities and the individuals the tools that they need to prepare. And we know the difference that preparedness can make. In fact, one of the best examples is actually playing out right now in India, where Americares is responding to Cyclone Fani in Odisha. There were more than 1 million people that were evacuated ahead of the cyclone. We're talking about 10,000 villages, more than 50 towns on the East Coast, and this is one of India's poorest states, and yet 1 million people were able to be evacuated. There was a plan, and there was also a very clear message. A cyclone is coming. Get to the shelters. That message was broadcast in local languages, blasting on a loop. There were coastal sirens, 2.6 million text messages, tens of thousands of volunteers, emergency workers, police officers. There were buses at the ready to get people to 800 emergency shelters. And it worked because the result was far different than what happened 20 years ago in the same region. When a cyclone hit and left thousands of people dead, wiped out entire villages. And it was different because there was a plan and because they were prepared. And that started right after what happened in 1999. So they started building shelters. They talked about what they needed to do, getting the message out. And remember, the message just days ago was very simple. Cyclone is coming, get to the shelters. It was also easy to understand because they met the need where it was. So yes, it was done in local languages, but it was broadcast, there were sirens, there were text messages, there were volunteers. People could go out and let people know that it was time to go. And this is something we see too. We see how important it is here in the US. When Florence and Michael hit, and I remember specifically for Michael talking to people afterwards where the storm roared ashore and talking to local officials where they went back to homes that they had already checked on because they needed to make sure people got out. Again, meeting people with the message where they are. And while 98% of those affected every year by disaster do live in developing countries, as we know, the US is not immune. If you look at just 2017, it was the costliest year for weather-related disasters in this country. Puerto Rico, obviously a perfect example of what can happen when there isn't perhaps as much of a plan. Certainly a lot is being learned today from what happened then, but even 7 weeks afterwards, half of Puerto Rico was still without power. So there's so much that goes into what needs to be taken into consideration for both the preparedness and then the after. Last fall, in the span of 2 months, as I mentioned, there was Florence, there was Michael, there were wildfires in both Southern and Northern California, and there were plenty of big headlines and big reminders. So again, what can be done? Well, it starts this morning, partially with this conversation. And so much of it is connected. It's about health, it's about education, it's about access to water, to food, to power, to communication, and ultimately how communities play a role. And when a community, not just an individual, but a community is ready to respond as a whole and to respond to their neighbors, that community can become more resilient.